Chapter 1. The Devil's Candle. There are villages which cling to the edges of England like old memories, half forgotten, shrouded in moss and fog, their roads too narrow for haste, their stories spoken low and seldom repeated. Black Hollow was such a place. Folded between moor and fen, hidden from the motorways and marked only by a crooked wooden sign, it had resisted the march of time with a quiet obstinance that made even cartographers uncertain if it still existed. It was in the spring of 1952, though in Black Hollow the seasons were best described not by weather but by what was lost, that Miss Jane Marple arrived, black-gloved and sharp-eyed, summoned not by duty nor affection, but by the curious and wholly unexpected funeral of her oldest acquaintance, the Reverend Martin Talbot. The invitation, handwritten in tight script upon coarse paper, bore no details beyond the date and time, no mention of illness, no allusion to accident. Simply a sentence, "The Reverend has passed, it would be good if you came." Signed oddly with no name. Miss Marple had known Reverend Talbot since 1911, when he was a lean and shy seminarian with an unfortunate stammer and an interest in Roman superstition. Over the decades their correspondence had thinned, yet never ceased entirely. The last letter she'd received from him 10 months ago had contained only a single phrase, "There is something buried here that should not be." It had been easy to dismiss then. Now it weighed more heavily, as the train drew her nearer to the valley, and the mist outside the compartment window deepened in tone, then texture, until it seemed to wrap itself around the carriage like memory given form. No one met her at the station. There were no cabs, only a dirt road, a hedge, and a sign that read, "To the Hollow, walk quietly." As she approached the village, boots gathering mud, gloves clutching the handle of her suitcase, she noticed an odd hush had settled over the houses, not the silence of tranquility, but that of paused breath. Curtains twitched, no one waved. A man with a white dog turned sharply from the path as she neared and crossed himself without a word. The church, a squat stone relic with a leaning bell tower, stood at the village's centre like a guardian that had long since forgotten what it was meant to protect. The funeral was small. A smattering of parishioners stood stiffly on the grass, their faces unreadable, their eyes rarely meeting hers. The coffin was plain, the vicar conducting the service was new, unfamiliar. He stumbled over the psalm, hesitated at the Lord's Prayer. He was a man of faith, he murmured, but of late, troubled. There was no eulogy, no hymn, only the quiet sound of the earth being moved, deliberately, without ceremony. Afterward, Miss Marple approached a woman she recognised from an old photograph in one of Talbot's books, the niece, Miss Lydia Talbot. "You came," the young woman said, though her tone held neither surprise nor relief. "Uncle spoke of you, especially toward the end. He said you would understand." "Understand what, precisely?" Miss Marple replied gently. Lydia hesitated. Her hands were trembling, though the day was not cold. "He believed that he had awakened something," she said, "something he found in the woods." There was no explanation, no further detail offered. But that night, at the old rectory where Miss Marple accepted Lydia's offer of hospitality, she began to notice what one might call peculiarities. The house was preserved oddly, as though frozen at the moment of its owner's last thoughts. A half-written sermon lay on the desk, the ink still uncapped. In the attic, boxes of books had been hastily overturned. Titles of theology and ritual lay scattered, some pages torn from their spines, others marked with charcoal in languages that did not belong to the Church of England, or any church. Most troubling of all, the vicar's personal diary, which Lydia claimed had always been kept by his bedside, was gone, vanished. No one had seen it since the night he ceased his prayers. That same evening, Miss Marple ventured into the study to examine the Reverend's bookshelves and found, tucked between 2 volumes of poetry, a newspaper clipping, yellowed, folded 4 times, and oddly out of place. The article was dated January 1903. Headline, "Unsolved Disappearance. 3 children vanished on candle night." Beneath the title, a black and white photograph, grainy, distant, yet focused enough to capture the gathered village, cloaked figures in front of the very same stone church. Men, women and children, but there, standing apart, just over the right shoulder of the group, barely noticeable unless one studied closely, a man in a long dark coat, eyes direct, hands behind his back, the face unmistakable. It was the man Miss Marple had seen earlier that day by the rectory gate, the one the villagers had crossed themselves over, the one no one named, but all appeared to fear. A man who should not have been in a photo from 1903, a man known only in hushed tones, and always at dusk, as the demon hunter. There are those who dismiss the supernatural out of hand, reasoned minds no doubt, fortified by logic and London air, who believe all things may be measured, named, or locked neatly within the drawers of explanation. Miss Marple, it must be said, was not such a woman, but neither was she the sort to be swayed by whispers or shadows at the window. She believed in people, their lies, their guilt, their curious need to conceal. She understood what most forgot, that the strangest truths are usually hidden behind the most polite facades. And yet, standing in the rectory study with the photograph in hand, the same chill passed through her fingers that she had once felt while opening a widow's letter describing the final smile of her late husband, a smile too wide, too knowing. Something about the photograph defied coincidence, and Miss Marple did not believe in accidents. At breakfast the next morning, Lydia Talbot served tea without a word, and stared too long into the distance. Her eyes, glassy and hollow, followed something no one else could see. She flinched at the sound of the kettle. When asked about the man by the rectory gate, she grew suddenly pale. Some say he came before the reverends. Trouble began, she whispered. Others say he never left. Who is he? Lydia's voice lowered. He doesn't speak, only watches. He appears where he shouldn't, in places no one saw him enter. They call him Gideon Black, but no one knows from where. Only that when he arrived, the birds stopped singing. Miss Marple raised her cup slowly. And do you believe he is what they claim? Lydia didn't answer. She merely looked away and began to hum a nursery rhyme under her breath. One Miss Marple had not heard in half a century. 7 stones and 7 vows, one for blood and one for bones, one for silence buried deep, 4 to guard the village sleep. That night, unable to sleep, Miss Marple lit a candle, the only source of light in the draughty guest room. The house groaned as old homes do, but beneath the sounds of settling timber, another noise repeated faintly, footsteps, slow, measured, just outside her door. She rose, stepped lightly across the floor and opened it, but the corridor was empty. At the far end, however, something caught her attention. The door to Reverend Talbot's private study had been locked when she arrived. Now it stood open, slightly ajar, a faint golden glow flickering within. With measured caution she approached. The floor creaked beneath her, the sound absorbed by the heavy hush of the house. As she pushed the door open, the candlelight flared. There, on the center table, stood a single black candle. It was unlit, but still smoking as though someone had extinguished it just moments before. She reached for it, only to recoil. The wax was warm. The desk bore more than just the candle. Scattered across the surface were fragments of burnt parchment, symbols drawn in what looked like iron filings, and a sealed envelope marked only with the word confession. Inside, a torn page. From the Reverend's missing journal, day 218. The dream has returned. The child speaks backwards, and I understand him. The 7th stone is broken. I cannot protect them. I've seen his face in the glass again. He does not age. He does not sleep. If I disappear, it will be because I chose to, not because I was taken. Miss Marple placed the page gently back into its envelope, and turned slowly, drawn again to the photograph from 1903, which she now kept folded in her handbag. The face of the man called Gideon Black still stared from its corner, unchanged, unwavering. In all her years in investigating motives, secrets, affairs, betrayal, and inheritance, she had never encountered a subject quite so steady. Yet there was more. The next morning, while exploring the churchyard in daylight, she encountered the groundskeeper, an elderly man with missing teeth, a nervous laugh, and hands that fidgeted endlessly with the hem of his jacket. When asked about Reverend Talbot's final months, he glanced about before replying.
He walked to the standing stones nearly every evening, the man said, barely above a whisper. Started after candle night last year, said the stones spoke, said there were voices in the soil. Did anyone go with him? Just that other fellow, Mr. Black, the one what doesn't cast no shadow at sunset. Miss Marple blinked. I beg your pardon. I seen it, the man insisted. Sun behind him, nothing on the ground, like the light passes round him. That evening, she requested to see the church records. Lydia retrieved them, a stack of ledgers and donation lists, volunteer rosters and registry pages. But in the middle, hidden between the records for baptisms and marriages, was a loose sheet folded twice and marked in ink, a crude map of Black Hollow. At its center, the church. Around it, 7 small circles, numbered and labeled by initials. One by one, Miss Marple began to match them. The schoolmaster, the groundskeeper, the apothecary, the butcher, all residents, all familiar faces from the funeral, all, she now realized, connected by something unspoken. She traced the circles with her fingertip until she reached the 7th. It bore no initials, only a name, Jane Marple. Her hand trembled, not from fright, but from the unmistakable sense that something long planned had already begun, that her presence in Black Hollow was no accident. And from the edge of the page, in the corner of the map where no path was drawn, someone had added a cryptic note in faded pencil. The devil's candle is never lit, it remembers its last flame. The candle remained in her memory that night, not merely as an object, but as a presence. It had no business being warm, no purpose sitting upon the Reverend's desk so quietly, except perhaps as a message or a warning. Sleep, when it came, did not come gently. Miss Marple found herself drifting through images without meaning, the village in reverse, doors opening without hands, and a face, his face, watching from behind the glass of an unreachable window. She awoke just after 3. The candle was gone. The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to the village post office. It was one of those small rural buildings that sold both stamps and string, gossip and barley sugar, with equal efficiency. The postmistress, Mrs. Uxley, wore a pinched expression and the scent of lavender soap. The Reverend's passing was a sadness, she said curtly, without being asked. But no surprise, he was troubled. In what way? Miss Marple prompted gently. Mrs. Uxley hesitated, one of those long theatrical hesitations that reveal more than they conceal. Well, she said, lowering her voice though the room was empty. He began asking strange questions, about the old stones, about candle night, even asked to see the ledger from 1903. Why that year in particular, he wouldn't say, only muttered about incomplete entries and how the list was one name short. Then he stopped sleeping, or eating, would stand in the churchyard at dusk, just waiting. For what? That man, Gideon Black. A subtle tremor passed through Mrs. Uxley's face, as though she had tasted something bitter. He doesn't speak. Did you notice? Not once. Just stands by the edge of things, never enters, never interrupts, but always listening. And his coat, it never seems to move in the wind, never creases, never changes. Miss Marple nodded slowly. When did he arrive? Months before the Reverend's decline. Showed up on candle night, just as the bell tolled 13. 13. A mistake, they said. Mechanical fault. But it rang clear, and it rang loud. Before she left the post office, Mrs. Uxley offered one final note, more a whisper than a statement. You'd best not stay long. Black Hollow remembers, and it forgets slowly. Back at the rectory, Miss Marple found Lydia standing in the kitchen, staring at the wall. The girl did not move until Miss Marple spoke. What is candle night? Lydia blinked as though waking from somewhere distant. Her voice came slowly, each word peeled from memory. It's the oldest festival in the Hollow, older than the church. They used to light candles from the center stone and carry them through the village to keep something in, not out. And the stones, 7. Though one broke long ago, Reverend Talbot said they were markers, guardians, he called them, that each was bound to a life. Miss Marple asked gently, and what happens if all 7 fail? Lydia's lips parted. No sound came. Later that afternoon, as the village lay in a rare and quiet warmth, Miss Marple visited the standing stones. They lay beyond the orchard, down a narrow path of nettles and ash trees, behind a rusted gate that no longer latched. The stones were older than anything else in the village, towering, rough-hewn, marked with symbols nearly erased by time, and one, indeed, was broken, not toppled, shattered, cracked through the center, with its jagged halves leaning apart like a tooth pulled wrong. As she stood among them, a breeze stirred. A sound barely perceptible rose behind her, a whisper, not words but intention. She turned, no one, but something lay at the base of the broken stone, half buried in earth. She knelt, unearthed it, a locket, still warm, inside, a photo of Reverend Talbot, and beside him, unmistakably, Gideon Black. Miss Marple turned the locket over, a word engraved on the back, nearly rubbed away, heirloom. That evening, as the candlelight flickered in her room once more, though she had not lit it, nor remembered placing it, she opened the village archive stored in the rectory's cellar, yellowing newspapers, family Bibles, council records, all stacked carelessly, as though someone had searched in haste. Then, between the pages of a discarded hymn book, she found it, a telegram, undated, unsigned. It read only, "If she arrives, the pattern will complete. She is the 7th. Do not let her light the candle." Miss Marple paused, hand steady, breath slow. The room seemed to narrow. The 7th. Slowly she rose, and walked to the window. Across the garden, near the broken hedge, stood a figure in a dark coat, watching. Gideon Black. He raised his hand, not in greeting but in recognition. Miss Marple did not wave. She closed the curtain, and for the first time in many, many years, she felt truly uncertain of what tomorrow would bring.
Chapter 2. A Cry in the Mist. There is something particularly unnerving about being observed in one's own reflection, the uncanny sense that the image within the glass may, at any moment, choose to do something one has not. When Miss Marple drew the curtain the previous night, it had not been the wind that unsettled her, nor the cold, nor even the certainty of the man watching from the hedgerow. It was the unmistakable sensation that he had been watching for longer than she had been awake, that his gaze had not discovered her, but resumed. She slept little, and when she did, it was the sort of sleep that mimics wakefulness, every sound filtering through the half-closed veil of awareness, a floorboard creaking, the window latch shifting, once the faintest tapping as though from the inside of the glass itself. At 4:30 the mist came. It arrived without wind or warning, a thick gauzy sheet that poured over the moor like a curtain drawn by unseen hands. The rectory's outline blurred, the trees became smudges. From the village bell tower, no chime marked the hour. The silence was not complete, but selective, as if only certain sounds were permitted. And then it began. A voice, a child's voice, whispered, barely above breath, yet impossible to mistake, from beyond the garden wall. "He is coming back." Miss Marple rose without hesitation, wrapped a shawl about her shoulders, and stepped to the window. The mist did not part. It swallowed the view entirely, leaving only the memory of shapes. But the voice came again, this time closer. "He is coming back. He is coming back." And then silence, not the quiet of conclusion, but the pause before something else. In the morning, Lydia Talbot did not rise. Her room, when Miss Marple checked it, was cold and empty, the window open. Her shawl had been left folded upon the chair, far too deliberately, as if placed for display rather than warmth. Yet she returned a full hour later, with no memory of having left. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her fingernails dirty, and her nightdress stained with soil. She had no explanation. "I must have been dreaming," she said faintly. "I was in the orchard, I think. I heard a lullaby. Someone was singing it, but the words were all wrong." Miss Marple made no comment, only offered tea. Later that morning, while visiting the apothecary, a man of few smiles and fewer truths, Miss Marple overheard a conversation that was not meant for her. Two women, standing just beyond the beaded curtain, spoke in that urgent, hushed cadence that suggests a brutal fact kept just beneath the surface. Another child gone, Elsie, from Bramble Row, vanished near the stones. That makes 3, in 2 years. The midwife says it's the hollow punishing us for forgetting, Miss Marple stepped from behind the curtain with perfect poise, but her words, when spoken, were pointed. "Which midwife, may I ask?" There was a silence. A flicker of indecision passed between the women like a shadow. Agnes Poulter, lives near the river mill." Miss Marple thanked them and left. The Poulter house stood crooked, as if leaning away from the water. It smelled of herbs, old wood, and salt. Agnes Poulter herself was sharp-featured and sharper-tongued, though her voice softened when she learned who Miss Marple was. "You're the one he wrote to," she said. "Reverend Talbot, he said you asked the right questions, not like the others." Miss Marple sat across from her, folded her gloves neatly, and listened. "There was a child," Agnes said after a long pause, "born 2 years ago, during candle night. Mother died during labour. The babe, he was strange, wouldn't cry, wouldn't blink, eyes too dark. When I looked at him, it felt like he was listening for something. What happened? Disappeared. 3rd night, swaddled and laid in the cradle by the fire. Gone by dawn. No signs of entry. The latch was drawn, the hearth cold, and the Reverend, he came to see me the next day, asked for my notes, said he had found a clue in the church vault, something about a name missing from the birth registry. I told him there was no name. The mother died before giving one." Agnes looked down at her hands, gnarled, unsteady, but there was a mark on the child's foot, a small crescent just below the heel, like an old scar, the same mark the villagers used to carve on candles for the old rites, when they still believed the hollow had to be paid for peace. "Paid how?" Agnes said nothing. That evening, Miss Marple returned to Bramble Row. The house of the missing girl, Elsie, stood shuttered and still. The child's mother had locked herself inside, but Miss Marple noted the flowers at the windowsill, rosemary and yew, bound together with red thread, protection in some traditions, warning in others. She walked past the church, past the mill, and toward the orchard again, the same path Lydia had wandered unknowingly. The mist had returned, and with it the silence. A sound startled her, not a voice, this time. Laughter, high, distant, a girl's, from the direction of the standing stones. Miss Marple turned, stepped carefully between the roots and bramble. The mist thickened, but her footing remained steady. She moved with intention, the sort one learns only after decades of watching people lie without realizing they are doing so. And there among the stones, something pale. She approached slowly. A child's doll, hand-stitched, face embroidered with thread, one eye missing, the other wide, staring. She bent, lifted it, and paused. There, on the doll's forehead, unmistakable, a drop of red, fresh, still wet, as if applied only moments before. The doll did not belong there. That was Miss Marple's first observation, and a certainty she trusted more than most. Its thread was newer than the soil it rested upon. The stitching of its dress bore the patterns of modern fabric, mass-produced and sold in small village shops no more than 5 years ago. The face, while handmade, had been crafted with patience, a mother's perhaps, and love, which made its presence near the 7th stone all the more disturbing. The drop of blood, if blood it was, did not smear when touched, but left a faint impression on Miss Marple's glove, not crimson, but rust-dark, still damp, and fresh enough to suggest it had not been there long. She examined the ground, no footprints, no sign of a child's passage, yet the stone beside the doll bore scratches, irregular, shallow, but recent, not from age or weather, but from something pressing hard and often against its surface. And beside those markings, something even more unusual, a line of small smoothed river pebbles arranged in a circle. 7, precisely. She turned toward the path, but stopped. A sound, not a footstep this time, but a breath, drawn in and held, just beyond the mist. "Elsie," she called. "Nothing. Elsie, if that is you, come forward. No harm will come. You have my word." The breath was gone. She remained a moment longer, then carefully wrapped the doll in her handkerchief, tucked it into her satchel, and made her way back toward the rectory. But when she arrived, something was wrong. Lydia was standing in the garden in her nightdress, barefoot and facing the trees.
Her arms hung at her sides, her hair was matted with dew. Miss Marple called to her. No answer. She approached and gently laid a hand on the girl's shoulder. Lydia's eyes opened slowly. Her lips parted. "He was here," she whispered. "He whispered to me, from the hedge." "Who, my dear?" "The one in the coat. Gideon Black. He said I was the second. He said it was nearly time." Miss Marple guided her inside, lit the fire, and brewed a strong pot of tea laced with rosemary from the windowsill. Lydia did not speak again that night, but when she slept, her hands curled inward, as if grasping something that wasn't there. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the church. Reverend Talbot's replacement, a man named Peveril, younger than his predecessor and already fraying under the weight of Black Hollow's silences, met her by the gate. "You found the stones," he said, before she had spoken a word. "Yes." "And the child's toy?" "Yes." He looked past her shoulder. "They've always taken them to the stones. It's part of the pattern. First the whispers, then the offering. You speak as though this has happened before." Peveril hesitated, then reached into his coat and produced a folded slip of paper. "Found this in the church bell tower. Dated 1903. Thought you'd want to see." Miss Marple unfolded it. A telegram. "Candle night failed. 3 gone. He is not bound. Send someone who remembers." "Who sent this?" "No signature. Just initials. M.T. "Martin Talbot." "No. Different hand. That's the part that bothers me." Miss Marple returned to the rectory just before noon, her mind turning over the same 3 details again and again: the doll, the missing girl, the pebbles, all pieces of something older, repeated. Not merely an accident, but a repetition, an echo. In the parlour she examined the Reverend's library once more. Hidden behind the hymnals, she found a thin volume titled Candle Rites of the Hollow, collected oral accounts. It bore no publisher, only hand-bound string and uneven pages. One page had been bookmarked with a withered sprig of yew. "When the cry is heard in mist, the hour is short. 7 stones, 7 bound. If the whisper reaches the gate, the next child is marked. The mark is blood, placed by no hand, drawn by no knife. It appears where it must." She closed the book slowly. The blood on the doll had not been smeared. It had not dropped from a wound. It had appeared as if summoned. That evening, she waited until dusk and walked once more to the stones. They were unchanged, the air heavier now, the trees still. She stepped among them, counted 1, 2, 3, until she reached the broken one. There, in the dirt, was something new, a scrap of cloth, torn child-sized, and on the stone itself, the word second, etched with something sharp, the lines still flaking at the edges. She turned, heart steady, breath measured. In the distance, the sound of something moving, not quickly, not slowly, just deliberately. And in that moment, she understood something chillingly simple. This was no longer about Reverend Talbot, nor about Gideon Black. It was about the sequence. Someone, somewhere, was counting. The sequence. A word so clinical, so ordinary, and yet in that moment, it became the most chilling thing Miss Marple had considered in many years. Not merely because it implied intention, but because it implied knowledge. The kind of knowledge that preceded every tragedy of human design, where someone knew precisely what would happen, and when, and to whom. She left the standing stones without turning her back, walking with the measured calm of a woman who had once exited a drawing room after accusing the host of poisoning his own wife with tea laced in camphor, and survived the subsequent silence. The villagers did not meet her gaze as she passed. A dog barked once, then stopped, as if it too had seen enough. At the rectory, Lydia sat beside the fireplace, knitting with a concentration too fixed to be entirely natural. Her fingers moved with rhythm, but her eyes were distant. "Have you spoken to the child's parents?" Miss Marple asked. Lydia nodded, slowly. "The mother won't speak. The father tried to break into the church last night." "To do what?" "He didn't say, but he carried a hammer, and rage. A violent reaction for a man who used to trim roses and bake bread." Miss Marple sat beside her. The doll was still wrapped in the handkerchief, now resting on the table between them. Lydia did not look at it. "Did you know her, Elsie?" Lydia's voice trembled, but only once. "She used to play by the apple tree in the orchard. Always wore a red ribbon. Said she liked the stones. thought they were giants who fell asleep. There was a long pause. Then Lydia said something quietly, too quiet perhaps, to have been intended aloud. She told me she heard singing in the soil. Miss Marple looked up. When? Last week. Later that evening, just before dusk, Miss Marple returned to the Reverend's study alone. She brought with her the telegram, the book of candle rites, and the doll. One by one she placed them upon the desk, opened her notebook, and began assembling what she knew. A sequence, 7 stones, 1 broken, a child born with a mark, 3 vanishings across 2 years, a whisper in the mist. But what was missing? A motive, not just for the vanishings, but for her, for Jane Marple. Why had Talbot written to her? Why the journal? Why had her name appeared on the map alongside the others? And then she remembered the envelope. Confession. She opened it once more, studied the torn journal page again, and this time with slower eyes. At the very bottom, faint and hurried, a note scrawled so faintly, it vanished unless held at a slant to the light. It must be someone from outside, someone they won't suspect. The pattern won't hold unless all 7 are witnessed. She closed the book. The implication was clear. The Reverend had not only known of the sequence, he had tried to disrupt it. But to do so, he had involved her, perhaps as a witness, perhaps as a replacement, or perhaps as a variable. At midnight, a knock at the door broke the silence. Lydia had gone to bed. Miss Marple opened it herself, and there stood Gideon Black. His coat was dry despite the rain, his boots clean, his expression unreadable. He said only one thing: "She isn't the first to go missing near the stones, but she may be the last." "What do you mean? The pattern ends soon, then it begins again. What happens in between?" He glanced past her toward the fireplace, his eyes fixed upon the doll. "That depends on whether the final hour is reached." He turned to leave, but Miss Marple stopped him. "Are you part of this?" He did not turn back. "Ask the midwife," he said. "Ask her what happened in 1903. And then he vanished into the mist. The next morning, a note appeared on the church door. No one saw it posted. No one claimed to have written it. It read, "There will be another cry tonight. It always happens in 3s. Lydia did not come down for breakfast. Her bed had not been slept in. Her shawl, again left folded on the chair.
Chapter 3. The Hollow Men. There are moments, few and thin, when a village exhales in unity, not from joy nor peace, but from resignation. When the waking hours hold no answers, and the night has begun to whisper in voices too old to name. In Black Hollow, such a moment had arrived. Lydia's empty bed stood undisturbed, her shawl folded in a perfect square, and the air in her room was still, not from calm, but from absence. Miss Marple stood at the door for several minutes, unmoving, not out of indecision, but calculation. The shawl had been folded with precision, not in haste, not by a sleepwalker, which meant someone else had been here, or she had prepared herself for something she did not intend to explain. There was no note, no message, no misplaced shoes, only silence, and in that silence, the first sensation of something she would later describe, not with fear, but with gravity, as displacement, that things were now out of step. She descended the stairs without touching the banister, and was met not by a servant, nor by the usual post at the door, but by a message slipped under the threshold. No stamp, no sender, only one line in block script. "The third has already walked." The handwriting bore no flourishes, no loop, no curl, as if written by someone unfamiliar with the very concept of handwriting itself. By mid-morning, the village had begun to change. Slowly, but undeniably, curtains were drawn at noon. Children no longer played along the lane. The bell at the church failed to ring the hour. Dogs, once loud and territorial, had gone quiet, those that remained. Several, according to the butcher, had simply vanished. No struggle, no sound, just gone. At the grocer's, Miss Marple overheard one of the tenant farmers mutter to his wife, "I saw him again, by the moor, 3 in the morning, same coat, same hat, same face. He wasn't walking, he was waiting." Another replied under her breath, "That's how they move, the Hollow Men, one step at a time, always in the same direction. until they're in your doorway." The grocer himself added nothing, but when Miss Marple made her purchase, she noticed his hands shook as he passed her the change. By early afternoon, she had made her way back to the church, not through the front door, but through the vestry, whose key she had borrowed from Peveril 2 nights earlier, on the pretext of needing quiet for reflection. The vestry was seldom used. Dust gathered quickly in Black Hollow, yet here, the floor had been disturbed. Beneath a threadbare rug, something waited, hidden not from eyes, but from thought. She pulled back the rug. Beneath, old floorboards, weather-warped, ill-fitted. One creaked differently. She knelt and pressed. It gave way with the reluctant groan of wood moved too many times. There, etched into the underside of the plank, were symbols, not letters, not runes, lines, circles, spirals, no, not that word, coils perhaps, interlocked forms that had no clear beginning or end, some filled in with a blackened resin, others scratched and left raw. In the centre of the largest, a handprint, child-sized. Miss Marple ran a gloved finger over the resin. Sticky, still drying, not ancient, recent. She replaced the board, stepped back, and stood motionless for some time. Then, turning on her heel, made for the apse of the church. There, beside the altar, stood a carved panel, long believed to be decorative, but upon closer examination, the wood bore the faint outline of a map, not of Black Hollow as it stood today, but as it once was. 7 structures, each surrounding a circle. The circles were the stones, the structures, homes. The 7th bore no name, only a mark, the same crescent, once described by Agnes Poulter. As she traced her gloved hand along the engraving, the door behind her creaked open. Peveril entered, his face pale, his hair damp with perspiration. "It's Lydia," he said. "She's back, but something's wrong." "Where is she?" "At the inn." She walked in barefoot, muttering. "They say she's speaking Latin." Miss Marple did not ask how he knew, only followed. The Hollow Inn was rarely full, but its doors remained open year-round. Inside, the common room was still, save for the girl seated by the hearth, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes vacant, her lips moving in rapid repetition. "Quay ca camodit, quay ca camodit, quay ca camodit." Miss Marple approached. "Lydia?" The girl looked at her, truly looked, and for a moment her eyes flickered with recognition, then vanished. "He waits in the 7th stone," she whispered. "He waits where the child sang. 7 must forget, 1 must remember." Then her hand shot forward, not to strike, but to offer. Something clenched in her palm. It was a candle, black, twisted, bound at the base with something white, bone. "A gift," she said. "From whom?" "From the Hollow Men." Miss Marple did not take it, nor did she refuse. She simply stared, and in that silence a memory returned, of the telegram, the sequence, the heirloom, the confession, the doll with a drop of red, and the man who cast no shadow at dusk. The pattern was not repeating. It was finishing, one step at a time. The candle remained unclaimed. Lydia's hand, outstretched with eerie stillness, neither trembled nor forced it forward. She seemed to know, or believe, that Miss Marple would take it eventually, that the transaction was not about timing, but inevitability. Yet Miss Marple, in her quiet precision, understood the weight of hesitation. It is not always weakness. Often, it is the mark of one who recognizes when she is being watched, not with curiosity, but with expectation. She did not take the candle. She did not speak. She simply turned away. Lydia lowered her hand, closed her fingers over the object once more, and resumed whispering in that tongue, not the Latin of prayer or ritual, but a darker strain, one that had emerged, not from book nor cathedral, but from mouths that once spoke it at night, long before the church arrived. Outside the inn, the fog had returned. It no longer crept. It stood, still, heavy, familiar, and from its edges, movement, not footsteps, not figures, a presence, the way one knows they are not alone, even when the room is empty. The villagers no longer asked questions. The grocer shut early.
The blacksmith refused to cross his threshold. A woman near the chapel door dropped her groceries and stood staring into the mist as though listening for instructions. Miss Marple passed her without a word and returned to the rectory, where the parlour had grown colder and the fire burned low despite being recently fed. She gathered her notes, spread across the desk, the telegrams, the confession, the locket, the crude map with its incomplete markings, and began for the third time to trace the names. Talbot, Agnes, the schoolmaster, the midwife, the girl, herself, 6, and now Lydia, not the 7th, but the sign, the warning that the count was nearly finished. The black candle, what did it represent? A marker, a bond, or a clue, too ancient for her to yet understand? She withdrew the diary page once more. Talbot's final words scratched beneath the confession. If the child sings, we are too late. If the hollow men gather, there will be no one left to count. That evening, she returned to the church, not out of curiosity, but necessity. The vestry stood silent, the corridor cool. Peveril had not been seen since midday. The symbols beneath the floorboards still pulsed with a faintly sticky sheen, though the resin had begun to dry. But as she turned to leave, her foot struck something just beyond the baseboard, a sliver of bone, not animal, not ornamental, carved, sharpened to a point, and marked with the crescent. She wrapped it in cloth, placed it gently in her satchel, and rose to leave, only to find herself facing the church mirror, a tall, ornate thing, framed in brass, usually reserved for weddings and ceremonial processions. She looked into it, her reflection stared back, as expected, but something else caught her eye. In the far corner, near the pews, a shape, unmoving, not approaching, not retreating. She turned to face the room directly. Nothing. She looked back to the mirror. It was still there, a man, coat to the floor, hands clasped behind his back, the expression unreadable, not watching, waiting. She turned again, deliberately, eyes sharp, pulse measured. The room, once more, appeared empty, and yet the glass insisted. You are not alone. She reached slowly into her bag. Her fingers brushed against the cloth-wrapped bone. The diary, the doll, the mirror flickered. A flicker. Yes, that was the right word. A momentary failure of presence. The man in the mirror did not vanish. He stepped forward, just once, and then stopped. He did not blink. The man in the mirror stood with the stillness of memory, not motion, as though caught in an image rather than a moment. The reflection did not distort, no trick of light, no warping of shadow. The glass showed what was there and what was not meant to be seen. Miss Marple did not flinch. She adjusted her posture, not out of fear, but in case she was being studied. It had long been her belief that people often revealed more in watching than in speaking, and so she watched him back. Her eyes remained fixed on the figure in the mirror. Her mind moved quickly, searching for the obvious explanation and dismissing it just as fast. No man had entered, no step had echoed, no door had opened. Still he stood. Then something else, so subtle it might have been missed, shifted in the glass. Not the figure, the candle. It was now in her reflection's hand, black, bone-bound, just as it had been in Lydia's grasp. But Miss Marple herself held nothing. She looked down. Her hands were empty, and yet, in the mirror they were not. She leaned forward. The flame of the candle, in the reflection only, flickered once, then steadied. She did not light it. The image had done so for her. Her pulse, though calm, now measured itself differently, not in fear, but in revelation. Something was attempting to control the narrative, not stop her, no, but direct, steer, coerce. She turned from the mirror, reached for the satchel. As her hand touched the bone-wrapped candle inside, the real one, cold and unlit, she felt something coarse beneath it, another paper, a message, tightly folded and hidden beneath the wax, inked in the same block hand as the earlier note. Only the 7th may light it. The others must watch, or vanish. She replaced the paper, closed the satchel, and extinguished the fire in the hearth. It was now quite late. The sky outside the rectory window had turned, not dark but grey, that old kind of grey that eats colour from the world rather than merely ending the day. She opened the parlour curtains slowly, and outside, standing at the garden wall, hands folded behind his back, was the same figure, Gideon Black. He did not move, he did not beckon, he simply waited. Miss Marple stepped out into the cold, gloves drawn tight. "You watched me," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "And you watched back. The mirror, the candle, the child. It has happened before, and it will again, unless someone breaks the pattern." Gideon looked toward the mist. "No, someone already tried, and now it continues. The hollow men, they do not walk, they wait. What for? The seventh." His eyes, pale, unreadable, turned to hers. "They think it is you, and you. I think it will not matter, if the candle is lit." With that, he turned and disappeared into the fog, not in haste, but as though he were returning to a place that required no doors. That night, the candle remained on her desk, still untouched, but just before dawn, whether by accident or by hand, none could say, a match was struck, a flame caught, and in the mirror, her reflection stood very still. Behind it, just over the shoulder, another figure.
Chapter 4. The Man Who Hunts Demons. There are those who pass through a place and leave behind nothing, not footprints, not names, not even the memory of their voice. And then there are those whose presence is felt long before they speak, long after they've left, and especially in the places where silence lingers too long. Gideon Black was such a man. When Miss Marple returned to the rectory after the mirror flame, a moment not imagined, but also not quite accepted, she found him seated on the garden bench. No sound had announced his arrival. No door creaked, the gate had remained latched, and yet there he sat, as though the bench had been made for him, or perhaps by him. His coat was uncreased, his shoes unsoiled despite the damp, and his hat rested neatly beside him. He did not stand when she approached, nor did he smile. "You lit it," he said. "It lit itself," she replied. "No, it cannot do that. The flame belongs to the one who bears the memory. And what memory would that be? The one you haven't spoken aloud yet." She sat beside him, not out of comfort but control. Miss Marple knew the weight of silence and the power of restraint. It had solved far more than outrage ever did. "You've watched me," she said, "since you arrived, and long before. Then you'll understand I prefer facts to riddles." He turned his head slightly, the light grazing his cheekbones with the sharpness of someone who had lived too long in places without welcome. "This place is a wound," he said quietly, "a thin place, stretched and healing badly. There are places in the world where the skin of things, of time, of reason is weaker. Black Hollow is one of them. And you, I go where the wound opens. I follow what escapes through it. Like a hunter, more like a caretaker. But they call me the other word." Miss Marple allowed herself a slow breath. "Talbot wrote to me," she said, "before he died. He believed something had been summoned, something he couldn't contain." Gideon's gaze narrowed. He was right, but he was also late. What he summoned arrived in 1949. But it didn't come alone. You were here then. I'm always where it begins. And how do you know when it begins? The same way I know how many dogs are missing. The same way I knew which stone would break first. It's all in the pattern. And what exactly escaped? For a long moment, Gideon said nothing. The mist moved between the trees. A crow passed overhead, flapping once before vanishing into the greying sky. "Something that wears the faces of men," he said, "but does not think like them. Something that remembers only its purpose, to hollow out the places it enters. One life at a time, one family, one village, until the land forgets what it once was, and becomes something else." "You mean possession?" "No, I mean replacement." Miss Marple studied his face. The lines were wrong, not aged but weathered, as though time had passed around him rather than through him. "You believe Talbot opened the door," she said. "He did. Then why is he not here to close it?" Gideon looked away. "And the village punished him. Not with force, but with silence. He went to them for help. He offered names, warnings. They turned away, because admitting it was real meant remembering they'd seen it before." "When?" 1903, 1856, earlier still. Always during candle night, always in sevens. And the seventh is the key. Gideon turned to her once more. "The seventh is always a stranger. They think it breaks the sequence. They're wrong. It completes it. Then why follow me? Because you're not like the others. How? You still believe truth is stronger than fear. Most don't. The wind shifted. A distant bell rang once, though the church, as they both knew, had not rung since candle night. Gideon stood. If you want answers, go to the post office. You've received something you haven't opened yet. From whom? He hesitated. From yourself. And without another word, he stepped into the fog and vanished. Gideon Black disappeared not as a man might flee, but as if the landscape had absorbed him, accepted his departure as casually as one exhales. The mist did not part, nor swirl in his wake. It simply resumed, indifferent. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer, her gloved hands folded precisely in her lap, the posture of a woman who had just heard a story she neither accepted nor dismissed, but stored, carefully, for later cross-examination. The post office, when she arrived, was almost too still. A single bell above the door gave its reluctant chime as she entered, and Mrs. Uxley, whose expression was typically trimmed in propriety, regarded her with something far colder. "There's been a delivery," the postmistress said, before Miss Marple could speak. She turned, retrieved a parcel from behind the counter, brown paper, tied in string, no postmark, no stamp, and placed it on the desk with the flat finality of one who did not wish to be asked questions. Dropped through the box early, before sunup, and no one saw who left it. Mrs. Uxley did not answer. Miss Marple opened the string slowly, the rustle of twine and paper cutting through the silence like the sound of a match being struck. Inside, a sheaf of aged papers, torn at the edges, bound in twine, some corners water-stained, others brittle with time, but unmistakable in handwriting, the tight, anxious script of Reverend Martin Talbot, his missing journal. The pages bore no titles, only numbered entries. She flipped through them with a scholar's hand, eyes scanning for sequence, for omission, for intention. Entry 43. I do not think the entity can be named. Every attempt dissolves upon the tongue. Entry 46. The voice no longer speaks, only in dreams. This morning, it called to me from beneath the flagstones. Entry 49. 3 are marked. The boy, the midwife, and the vicar's wife. I dare not write the name. She watches as I do. Then at entry 52, something different. A folded note, not in Talbot's hand, had been tucked between the pages. Pale paper, stiff with age, one word written in black pencil, confession, and beneath it, a single sentence. He was not the first to open it, only the first to write it down. She looked up. Mrs. Uxley was no longer behind the counter. The door had not chimed again. Miss Marple stood alone. The village beyond the post office window lay in that same unmoving silence, as if the moment itself had paused to let something pass through. She took the journal with her, slipped it into her handbag, and stepped out into the square. A man was crossing the lane ahead, not Gideon, not familiar, but his coat was long, and his gait deliberate. She saw him glance her way. He did not stop. He walked on, as if pacing out an exact number of steps. She did not follow, not yet. Instead, she returned to the rectory. The rooms felt less like rooms now, and more like the shadows of a structure that had once known warmth, and now merely waited for its next purpose. She sat by the fire, opened the journal again, and read entry 55 aloud. The candle burns without flame, and those who see it alight are no longer untouched. If you see him in glass, do not speak. If you hear the child in mist, do not follow. And if you are chosen as the 7th, you must decide, silence or light. She placed the pages beside her tea, and as she did, a small white envelope slipped from the back cover, sealed in red wax, her own name written in Talbot's hand, Miss Jane Marple. But the return address, stamped faintly in blue ink, was not from Black Hollow. It was from St. Mary Mead, her home, her own address, and the date marked on the back, posted 4 days before she left for the funeral. She had never seen it arrive, never received it, yet here it was, as if waiting, as if she had sent it to herself. There are moments in a life of quiet detection, and Miss Marple had known many, when the facts do not resist interpretation, but refuse even to conform to the notion of order.
The envelope in her lap was one of them. It was not impossible. It was worse. It was precise. Too precise to be random. The return address was unmistakable. 14 High Street, St. Mary Mead, the red brick cottage with the white rose climbing the left post. Her house, her paper, her handwriting, perhaps, though more upright, more formal. The ink was familiar, as was the slight hesitation before the final E in Marple, something she herself had always done since childhood. She turned it over. The wax was unbroken. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she walked to the old writing desk near the fireplace, where Talbot's locket, the black candle, the journal, and the telegram all lay arranged, not neatly, but as if waiting for connection. She added the envelope to the tableau, then returned to her chair and lit a single match. The fire crackled faintly. When she finally broke the seal, the paper inside was folded 3 times and smelled faintly of the church, old wood, old breath. The message was brief, typed, not written. If you are reading this, it means the pattern has resumed. You must not allow them to complete the 7. One will try to bargain, one will try to forget. The hollow men do not sleep, and Gideon lies, but not about everything. There was no name, but enclosed within the folds of the letter was something else, a torn photograph, black and white. It showed a man in clerical robes, Reverend Talbot, standing before the church, and beside him, partially obscured, was a group of children. 7, precisely. One face had been scratched out, not torn, not inked, scratched, deeply, and with rage, until the paper frayed. On the back, faint pencil read, Candle Night, 1949. The third had already changed. Miss Marple set the photo down carefully, her fingers now still. She remembered the previous entries, the twisted Latin, the voice from the hedgerow, the child's laughter from the mist. But what struck her most, and with growing clarity, was the choice of words, resumed, changed, lies. This was not only a repeating story, it was one that had been interrupted before, stopped, temporarily, by someone, and now, continued. As she sat there, assembling the fragments like one might piece together an heirloom quilt with a missing center, she noticed a faint tapping, not loud, not rhythmic, just once, then again, from the mirror. She turned her head, deliberately. There, in the hall mirror, the same from the parlor, was a reflection, not of herself, not entirely. It was her shape, her posture, her hands, but the expression on the face was wrong, just slightly. The corners of the mouth were turned upward, in a way she would never allow. The eyes did not blink. The reflection stood perfectly still, though she, seated in the chair, had just tilted her head. The reflection had not followed. Then, without warning, it moved. One blink, one tilt, but not in tandem with her. A moment out of sync, just enough to confirm whatever stood in the mirror was not her. She rose, walked to the doorway, slowly, with the weight of certainty, and as she stepped into the frame, the real one, not the reflection, she saw the image vanish, replaced by her own, as it should be, but on the glass, left behind, faint and nearly erased, the outline of a handprint, small, child-sized, and just below it, drawn in condensation. 6. She did not look away. Instead, she asked aloud, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, "Then I am next." From behind her, the sound of paper sliding to the floor, the missing journal pages, the last entries, the ones she had not seen. She turned, picked them up. The final one read, "I warned her. I warned them all, but they did not listen. They never do. The 7th must choose the light or the mirror. If she chooses neither, they all return."
Chapter 5. 7 Stones, 7 Souls. Some truths arrive with noise, with shouted names, broken glass, or a slammed door. Others arrive as Talbot's final warning did, folded quietly into paper, waiting in silence, speaking only when unfolded by the right hands. Miss Marple now sat among such fragments. The journal, the confession, the torn photograph, the wax-sealed envelope mailed from her own address, all laid out before her in the amber glow of a lamp that had once belonged to a bishop who, it was said, abandoned the cloth not for scandal, but because he saw something move behind the altar and could not bring himself to deny it. The mirror stood cold now, its surface free of handprints, its reflection behaving properly once more. And yet the echo remained, that faint memory of being watched by oneself, but not by oneself. It was a reminder, not of fear, of pattern. She turned once more to the journal, Talbot's handwriting by now a rhythm as familiar to her as a signature. Entry 58. I went to the stones again last night. The 7th is still broken. The others now show signs of erosion, but not from weather. It's as if the stone has grown brittle from within, as if each name marked against it draws the breath out of the rock itself. I performed the rite again, but without the 7th, it is only gesture. Beneath this, in a separate hand, a single line had been added. Containment requires sacrifice, a soul for a silence. Miss Marple closed the book softly, as if trying not to disturb something near, and then rising with uncharacteristic urgency, crossed to the window. The standing stones could not be seen from here, but she traced their alignment in her mind, remembering each position, each name, 6 now accounted for. And what of the 7th? That final unnamed piece, always left until last, chosen not because they were closest, but because they were furthest. A stranger, a witness, a variable, her. She returned to the desk and opened her own notebook, the one she had brought from St. Mary Mead, where she once noted the movements of neighbours and the contents of rose beds. Here, her notes had become something else. Names, dates, symbols, sketches. Beneath it all, the same phrase repeated 3 times. 7 stones, 7 souls. The meaning had eluded her at first, appearing merely as poetic symmetry. But as she compared the dates of disappearances, the journal entries, and the testimonies of the villagers, a shape began to emerge. Not a solution yet, but a framework. In the last 12 months alone, 6 unexplained vanishings. Children, adults, 1 dog walker who left the gate open and was never seen again, all filed as missing in the village log, but never pursued. Black Hollow, after all, did not like interference. And now, the 7th, the last to vanish, scheduled, according to Talbot's journal, to align with the next full moon, 2 nights from now. It was not only ritual, it was arithmetic. The rite beneath the stones, the one Talbot referenced, was older than parish records, older than even the carved wood in the church apse. It had not been intended as celebration, it had been built for containment, a holding pattern. Something to trap whatever it was that passed through these thin places and wore the faces of children, vicars, and those who did not cast shadows. She returned to entry 61. The last time it failed, there was a fire. The church burned from within. 7 graves marked with wax. None remembered who lit the flame, only that no one left after. Beneath it, again in the second hand, had been scrawled, "She will light it again, or be taken instead." Miss Marple lowered the page. The fire, the wax, the candle that had appeared, vanished and returned again in Lydia's hand. These were not symbols, but signals. Warnings passed down in half-spoken rhymes and muttered confessions, and then she noticed it. A new mark on her window pane. Not written, not etched. Smeared, a print, small, fingered in mud, not on the outside, but from within. 1 hand, small, deliberate. She stepped forward, heart steady, mind sharpened by decades of inquiry. The light from the desk fell across the print, and just above it, faintly written into the condensation by a single dragging finger, "You missed one." She did not gasp. She did not step back. Instead, she whispered to no one at all, "Elsie," and just before the mark faded, another word appeared beneath it. One she had not spoken since she first entered the hollow. Help. It would have been easy to assume the message on the window was imagined, the sort of trick the mind plays when overexposed to fear, repetition, or too many unsolved questions left overnight in a room with mirrors. But Miss Marple did not deal in impressions.
She trusted what she could see, what she could verify, and above all, what left residue. And the mud on the glass was residue. Real, traced by fingers small enough to belong to a child, but not erratic, not smudged, intentional. She retrieved a clean handkerchief from the drawer, dabbed gently at the edges of the mark, and folded it twice. She would examine the composition later, not for science but for context. The earth in Black Hollow was not uniform. The woods carried a different soil than the moor, and the moor was not the same as the banks near the standing stones. Mud had memory, so did water. She returned to the desk and reopened the journal, searching again through Talbot's final entries, not for ritual, but for geography. He had mentioned the stones, the rites, but also another place, referenced only once, in a line barely visible. The child does not walk the path. She returns where it opened, near the seventh stone, the broken one. That was where the locket had been found, where the doll had lain, where Lydia's voice had shifted into Latin, and the girl named Elsie had last been seen. And if she had returned, then the stones had opened again. But returned how? That was the question. Miss Marple did not believe in resurrection, not in the literal sense, and certainly not in folklore masquerading as fact. But she believed in memory, and more importantly, she believed in deception. If something had returned, it might not be the child, it might only appear as the child. She crossed to the hearth, and opened the small iron grate beneath the firebox, the one Lydia had once said contained ashes no one touched. There, tucked against the inner wall, she found it, a scrap of red ribbon, just long enough to tie a braid. Elsie's mother had said she always wore one, but this one was wet, and smelled of moss, not from the garden, not from the orchard, from the well, the village well, long sealed, hidden beneath a thicket near the orchard's edge, where the stone rim had crumbled, and the earth had closed around it, but the path still remembered. Miss Marple rose at once, and went into the hallway. The air had thickened, not in temperature, but in density. Sound carried differently, her footsteps absorbed. The clock at the end of the corridor had stopped, not at midnight, but at 1:13, that same time again. Candle night. She took the key from beneath the lamp where she had hidden it, the one Peveril had given her for the church storeroom, and slipped it into her pocket, along with the folded ribbon and the marked handkerchief. Outside, the fog returned in bands, not walls. Patches of visibility opened and closed like breath, and between them, trees stood as guardians, or watchers, their silhouettes too still, too symmetrical. The path to the stones had changed, not in form, in sense. It no longer led forward, it felt like it led down. As she reached the seventh stone, the broken one, she saw it immediately, not the stone, the figure, kneeling, facing away, a child, bare feet, red ribbon in hair, not moving, not crying, not reacting. Miss Marple stood her ground. "Elsie," she said quietly. No reply. "Elsie, if you can hear me, say something." The girl tilted her head, but not toward the voice, toward the stone, as though listening to it. Then slowly she turned, and for just a breath, a heartbeat, a blink, Miss Marple saw her own face, superimposed over the child's, not entirely, not clearly, but enough to know this was not return, this was reflection, this was replacement. Then the girl blinked, once, and vanished. No sound, no step, only the faint smear of a muddy handprint, left on the side of the stone. Beneath it, a word, traced crudely, soon. The word was not carved, it had no depth, no pressure in the stroke. It had been written in a child's hand, uncertain, shaky but not afraid. That, to Miss Marple, was the most unnerving detail. Children who wrote messages in mud, alone at ancient stones in the fog, ought to be afraid, and yet this one had not been. She stood motionless before the seventh stone, now streaked in dirt and meaning. The surrounding air offered no birdsong, no breeze, and from the trees behind her, not even a creak, just stillness, a waiting sort of stillness. Miss Marple reached into her satchel and withdrew the journal again. She did not sit. She read standing, coat buttoned, gloved hand steady. Entry 67. There is no reversal. The right was not meant to summon, only to cage. but it requires continuity. 7 souls tied to 7 stones. If one is missing, the structure holds, but if the 7th walks away, the ink here was smudged. A line continued beneath it, in hurried script. The containment breaks not at the 7th, but through the 6th. That is why the 6th forgets. Miss Marple blinked, then turned the journal sideways, tracing the looping lines at the margins. One word repeated there, forget. It explained Lydia. The memory lapses, the blank wanderings, the voices she claimed not to remember. Lydia had not been possessed. She had been made to forget, because she was the 6th, the one who tethered the pattern until the 7th confirmed it. And now, with the full moon 2 nights away, the hollow was nearly finished choosing. She tucked the journal away and turned from the stones. There was nothing left to see here, not with the eyes. The rest would have to be uncovered elsewhere. That night, she returned to the rectory. She did not light a fire. The house was too quiet, and warmth now seemed to draw out memories better left dormant. Instead, she sat in the kitchen and opened her notebook once more. She began listing names, not victims, not suspects, but positions, roles. First, the gatekeeper. Second, the watcher. Third, the voice. Fourth, the witness. Fifth, the protector. Sixth, the forgotten. Seventh, the chosen. She stared at the last line for a long time. The chosen. Gideon had said the 7th completed the pattern. Others had said the 7th broke it. Both could not be true. Unless, and this was a thought she had not allowed herself until now, the 7th wasn't a victim. The 7th was a key. That night she slept with the journal beneath her pillow. She did not dream, but in the early hours before dawn she awoke to a sound. Fingertips, gently tapping the glass of her bedroom window. Not rapping, not knocking, tapping, rhythmic. One pause between each. She rose, crossed the room, and stood before the glass. The curtains were already open. She hadn't opened them, but they were. Nothing stood outside, not visibly, but on the inside, pressed faintly against the glass, another handprint, smaller than before, and beside it, drawn in condensation, 6 is broken. Then, as if scraped into the mist with a fingernail, a final word appeared, one that did not belong to any child, one that had been whispered at the stones, murmured in Latin, and feared by Reverend Talbot. Containment. The word lingered for only a moment, then faded, but beneath it, the message remained, for tomorrow was the final night, and the 7th had not yet chosen.
Chapter 6. The Descent. One seldom hears a clock tick in dreams. Yet Miss Marple awoke not to the chime of the hour, but to its absence. The silence in the rectory had grown louder overnight, not the gentle hush of sleep or solitude, but a vacant kind of hush that echoed its own void. Her bedside clock was still, its hands at 1:13 again. She had replaced the batteries the day before. Downstairs, the fire in the parlour was lit, though she had not lit it, and the pages of the journal left folded on the desk had been reordered, not carelessly, purposefully. Entry 67 had been moved to the back, and a new page, one she had never seen before, had been inserted. The handwriting was unmistakably Talbot's, but it was dated 3 days from now. The loop begins with the 7th. It always has. The mirror lies. The Moor listens. Time breaks not where the crack begins, but where the crack is ignored. She is here already. She is remembering. She is choosing. Miss Marple stared at the entry for a long time. Then she did what she had not done in nearly 50 years. She took a match to the hearth, extinguished the flames, and traced the ashes for any symbol left beneath. There was one, a circle, broken at the top, inside the number 7. She moved quickly that morning, not out of panic, but urgency. Lydia had not come down. The kitchen remained untouched. The tea things were still stacked as she had left them the evening before. She climbed the stairs and stopped. The bedroom door was ajar. The voice came from within, not Lydia's voice, older, cold, uttering syllables that moved with rhythm but no meaning. Miss Marple knew Latin, ecclesiastical, academic, spoken, but this was not that. This was an older tongue, pre-structure, pre-church, rootless, yet commanding. She stepped inside. Lydia stood at the window, her eyes open but empty, her mouth moving with slow determination. On the glass, 7 dots formed a perfect arc, as if drawn by fingertip. Above them, a smear of blood. Miss Marple spoke her name, but Lydia did not turn. Only when the 7th dot was complete did her body still. Her voice stopped, and her legs gave way. She caught her before the fall could break her completely, but the girl was limp, her breathing shallow. Not unconscious, no, but somewhere in between, as though she had been speaking for someone else, or something else. Later that afternoon, the mist returned to the moor, but it came fast, not like weather, but like release, like something held back until now. With it came a silence so complete that even the dogs ceased barking, those that had not already vanished, and so began the whispers, not just in the woods, not just among the standing stones, but in the mouths of villagers, quiet at first, then louder, accusatory. She brought the stranger. She was at the church the night the bell rang without sound. Talbot trusted her, and now look, one man spat near her feet as she passed the butcher's lane. Wherever she walks, things vanish. The postman, who had always greeted her with cheer, refused to take her letter, and Gideon Black, gone, without trace. The room he had taken at the inn was empty, his name scratched from the ledger, and in its place, a page torn from Talbot's journal. If the 7th resists, the loop breaks, but if she forgets, it begins again. He told me I would not remember him next time. He was right, and yet he is always there, just out of frame, watching. As she turned the corner by the church, she heard the commotion before she saw the source. Villagers shouting, the vicarage bell clanging once, sharply, then silence. Inside the church, light filtered through the east window, and there, above the altar, something hung inverted, motionless, a man, bound, not by rope, but by reeds and waxed cloth. He had no expression, no sound, no motion, but etched into the stone beneath him, scrawled as though by finger into the dust of ages, was one word, Marple. She did not move, not at first, not when the villagers turned to her, not when someone whispered the word curse. Only when she stepped back into the outer vestibule did she see the envelope left on the church bench. No address, just her name. Inside, a photograph, sepia, folded, old, a school field, girls in uniform, and there, in the background, barely visible, yet unmistakably him, Gideon Black, behind her, in the photo, taken nearly 60 years before, and he had not aged a day. That night, as the mist thickened and the villagers lit no lamps, Miss Marple locked her door and moved the mirror to face the wall. She began cross-referencing names and entries, journal ink and village records, even the dusty baptism ledgers left behind by Talbot. What she found was not an error, it was an omission. In each of the 6 deaths over the past year, one common witness, Gideon Black, always nearby, never mentioned, never questioned. The 7th, she now believed, was not just chosen, the 7th was led, and that meant the pattern was not repeating by chance, it was being preserved. If the mirror lies, she thought, then what she remembers may be deception, and what she doubts may be truth. Outside a dog howled once, short, abrupt, then nothing. She turned down the lamp, folded the photograph of herself and Gideon into the journal, and whispered only one word into the stillness before bed. Why? And from the hall, as if in answer, came a second whisper, because you always do. The next morning brought no sun, only the pewter-coloured haze of a sky indifferent to the world below. Marple, dressed and composed, ventured into the churchyard, drawn by an impulse she could not quite name, or perhaps could, but refused to articulate. There, near the far wall where the ground sloped unevenly downward, she discovered the disturbed earth. It was not a grave. It was a gap, 5 feet across, as if the earth itself had opened not to bury, but to release. Laid beside it, 7 white stones, each marked with a symbol from the journal. The final stone bore her name, and beneath it, freshly scratched in slate, a message: the 7th must choose to remember, or all is looped again. A noise behind her, soft footsteps, bare on morning dew. She turned quickly, no one, but on the far wall of the church,
drawn in mud, as if with a child's hand, a large circle, broken at the top, and within it, this time, the number 8. She returned to the rectory to find Lydia gone. No trace, no note, no sound, only the fire, burning again, though she had not lit it, on the table, placed precisely at the centre, the black candle, melted halfway, cold, and beside it, folded thrice, a telegram. It read, "Received her, full cycle near. Do you remember your role?" Signed, The Hollow Men. Before she could blink, the candle ignited. No match, no flint, no spark, and in the mirror, though still turned to the wall, she saw, just for a moment, a face staring back, not hers.
Chapter 7. The Trap. The moment the wax melted was not marked by flame, but by the absence of shadow. One would expect the candle to cast flickers upon the stones. Instead, the standing circle swallowed the light whole, offering no reflection, no warmth. The doll, weather-worn, mud-caked, seemed to lean ever so slightly toward the centre, its stitched eyes now glistening as though wet. Beside it, Elsie's shoe remained upright, despite the uneven ground, toes pointed in the direction of the rising moon, as if by design. Miss Marple had placed them precisely where the journal had instructed, the foot of the northern stone, beneath the carved sigil resembling 2 eyes within a triangle. The journal had not explained the symbols, only that this was where the cycle had first been broken, or perhaps started. It was Marcus Trent who spoke first, the village carpenter, and one of the few who had not turned against Miss Marple, whispered as though he feared the stones might hear. "This place has never been mapped. Every time someone tried, the sketch came back wrong. Scaled wrong. Angles all off. They said it was just poor measurement, but it wasn't." The second ally, Edith Harrow, the town's former schoolmistress, knelt beside Miss Marple, holding Reverend Talbot's journal open at the final ritual entry. Her finger trembled as she traced the margin note, "Use the relics, but never the name." "We say nothing," Miss Marple replied, adjusting her gloves. "We place, we wait, we listen, that is all." The wind died entirely. Then, a sound. Not footsteps, not wind, but something dry, repetitive, from within the trees, chanting, but not from any of them. A sound older than the village, older than the church. The candle, still unburnt, grew shorter, and then, just beyond the line of stones, Gideon appeared. He staggered into the clearing with a violent reaction, half collapsed, covered in earth, and what looked like thorn marks across his face. His eyes were bloodshot, wide with a kind of brutal clarity. He was shaking, not from fear, but from rage. "You've started it," he gasped. "Fools, do you know what you've brought back? You vanished," Miss Marple answered calmly, "and your name is in records that predate you by decades. I suspect you have explanations." He laughed, dry, bitter, cracked. "I've been many names. Gideon Black is just the one I use here. The thing you're calling, it remembers every name I've worn." He fell to one knee, clutching at the ground. When he looked up, his voice lost its edge and turned low, cracked. "I have walked this earth for over 400 years, Miss Marple. I've watched cities vanish, maps change, but this place, Black Hollow, it never does. It's a wound that doesn't heal, a gate that forgot how to shut." Miss Marple narrowed her gaze. "And the child's voice, the whisper in the woods, that was not a memory, was it?" Gideon's eyes met hers. "No, that was a warning, from the last one who resisted." A pause. Then Marcus whispered, "Why now? Why her?" Gideon touched his side. Blood marked his coat, old and crusted. "Because it wears faces, familiar ones. Because it needs belief to return." Miss Marple turned toward the centre of the stone ring, toward the candle, the doll, the shoe, the relics of memory and loss. "And what does it fear, Mr. Black?" He answered without hesitation. "Truth, and pattern, and the moment a mind, your mind, breaks the loop." Then the chanting grew louder, but none of them were speaking. Miss Marple stepped forward, gaze fixed on the now melting candle. This isn't about appeasement, it's about repetition. Containment is only effective if someone believes it to be new. We are not here to repeat, we are here to end. Gideon winced as though the words themselves stung. Edith closed the journal quickly, almost as though to hide what they had just declared aloud. And then, a change. The trees beyond the circle swayed, though no breeze stirred, and from between their roots emerged figures, not walking, not crawling, standing, but wrong, still, not real, like shadows made solid. They bore no eyes, only faces shaped as though remembered by a faulty dream. Marcus stepped back. Edith grabbed Miss Marple's sleeve. Gideon remained frozen, lips parted, eyes wide. They are echoes, he whispered. Past attempts, failed ones. They always come when someone tries to resist. The chanting surrounded them now, neither loud nor soft, just there, constant, relentless. Miss Marple did not flinch. Instead, she spoke clearly into the silence. You cannot chant what has already been named. The trap is yours now, not ours. And with that, the candle's final inch hissed into darkness. A cold breath rushed through the stones. The relics, the doll, the shoe, the circle of salt they had drawn, vanished, swept away not by hand but by absence. In their place, one thing remained, a scrap of parchment, fresh, unburnt, with 5 words in familiar handwriting. The 7th is never random. Miss Marple looked up slowly, but the figures were gone, and the mist returned. Only this time, it carried with it the scent of salt and wax and something else entirely, something older than any of them had ever known. Chapter 8. The Last Death. The candle had burned itself down to a crooked stump, yet still it clung to shape. Smoke spiraled from its centre in a way that defied wind, defied logic. The moment it extinguished, the wind returned, a gust from nowhere, slamming shut the chapel gate with such force that Marcus Trent dropped the old brass bowl he had been holding. The sound rang out, sharp and final. Gideon stood motionless, blood dried in strange latticework across his brow, his chest rising and falling with unnatural slowness. Miss Marple had knelt once again, brushing her gloved fingers along the stone beneath the doll, now marked with a dark smear that had not been there moments ago. There was no sign of Elsie's shoe. Edith closed the journal. "It is finished," she whispered, but her tone carried no triumph, only the fatigue of someone who had recited a confession they no longer believed, and for a few precious minutes, quiet, the kind of quiet that dares one to speak first, lest they be proven wrong by the sound of something worse waiting to answer. No chanting, no shivering ground, only the ordinary hush of a night unwilling to admit what had passed. A storm did arrive, not one of thunder or rain, but a low barometric compression that pushed on the lungs. And then, before anyone could remark on it, Gregory Pike, a groundskeeper and lifelong resident of Black Hollow, cried out from the path near the vestry. When they found him, face blank, arms extended and pointing skyward, he was already gone. His boots were missing. His eyes reflected the stone circle, although he stood nowhere near it. 7. There were gasps. Edith stepped back. Gideon closed his eyes. Miss Marple simply straightened. "It's always someone who was near, never who you expect," she murmured, "and always just before the hour turns." By morning, it was as if a veil had lifted. The townspeople moved differently, still quiet, but with a cautious relief. The sheep returned to the northern field. The inn's door no longer stuck. The bell above the chapel tolled correctly at noon. Peace, perhaps not celebrated, was at least acknowledged. Gideon took to the hills that afternoon, wordlessly departing with only the journal in hand. He offered no goodbye, only a nod to Miss Marple as he passed her on the gravel path leading to the old orchard. "It's sealed?" she asked. He did not pause. For now. She waited until he had vanished over the rise. Then she returned to the inn. Her key turned smoothly in the door. She stepped into her room and saw herself asleep in the bed. Same dress, same hat, folded neatly on the bedside table,
same expression she imagined she wore when dozing mid-afternoon in the drawing-room at St. Mary Mead, but her reflection did not breathe, it did not stir. She did, and as the air turned dry again, and the faint sound of footsteps creaked above where no floorboards existed, Miss Marple slowly closed the door behind her, locking it with care. She did not scream. Instead, she moved forward. She reached the bedside and examined the figure, identical in every detail, from the stitching on the gloves to the faint ink stain on the left cuff. She touched the face, cold. Then, just as she leaned closer, a shadow passed across the mirror on the opposite wall. No door had opened, no curtain moved, yet it was there, and when she turned, the mirror no longer showed her alone. There were two reflections, one of Miss Marple standing, one of Miss Marple smiling, and somewhere far beyond the window, where the moor spread wide under a lowering sky, a single sharp sound cracked through the stillness, like a page torn from a diary. A sound no louder than a whisper, but one that made the candle's stub flicker once more, and then go utterly still. Was peace ever truly restored, or had the final hour simply not yet struck? And so, dear viewers, what do you believe Miss Marple saw in that mirror? A twin, a memory, or the price of a trap half sprung? Let us know below.
Chapter 9. Not all that dies. There are truths that do not survive the light of day, not because they are weak, but because they are rooted in shadows older than the sky. And when Miss Marple stood once more in that inn-room, staring at the figure so perfectly, so grotesquely identical to herself, she did not scream. She did not run. She merely stepped backward, as one does when reading a sentence that wasn't meant for them, eyes catching on the shape of an idea far too large to understand all at once. The door behind her had closed itself. No breeze, no touch, just finality, as if the house itself had drawn a breath and decided to hold it. She looked again at the bed. The figure remained still. The curtains did not move, and from somewhere beyond the wooden walls, the sound of a bell, not from this era, but older, brass-throated and tolling for something long past. She turned. The handle would not turn. It hadn't locked. It had ceased to function. Only then did she hear the voice, low, fractured at first, and impossibly close despite no one standing near. It was Gideon, yet not the Gideon she had left on the hillside, nor the one who bled beside the stones. This voice carried no warmth, no hope. It came from beneath the floor, or above the ceiling, or behind her own thoughts. You mustn't stay, it said. You weren't supposed to see it. She found herself back in the corridor, though she could not recall walking. The walls, yes, still timbered, now bore scratch marks in loops and arcs she did not recognize, but which her mind refused to call random. Something in her muscles remembered them. At the far end of the hall, a mirror. It had not been there before, nor had the table beneath it, upon which sat a folded telegram. Her name, her real name, misspelled, but unmistakable, and below it, a single word in Gideon's hand, run. But Miss Marple was not one to run. She turned the paper over. Nothing. She opened the drawer beneath the mirror. Empty, save for a child's drawing. 7 figures, one much smaller than the others, one much older, and a phrase, scrawled in a hand that could not have held the pen easily. We are the story. She is the change. As the hallway elongated, and Gideon's voice whispered again, clearer now, nearly frantic, she stepped forward into the mirror's reflection. Her face stared back, but it blinked before she did. This village is not a place, the voice said. It's a memory, or a prison, or both, but it resets, always resets. The 7th soul opens the door, and the first lie begins again. She pressed her hand to the glass, and passed through. She landed not with force, but with recollection, as if her body remembered a weight it had once cast off. The air was colder, denser, not with temperature, but meaning. There was soil beneath her feet, but no sound when she stepped. Trees that mirrored those outside Black Hollow's chapel reached up around her, and between them, twisted ropes of colourless fog, not mist, but memory made visible, wove through their trunks like roots torn free. The chapel bell no longer tolled, but from somewhere in the darkened glade, a quiet chant rose, one syllable, repeated, unmistakably human, yet robbed of emotion. She moved toward it, as one does when drawn not by sound, but by familiarity. Gideon waited in the grove. He looked different now, not younger, but unanchored, like a man worn smooth by centuries of forgetting. His eyes no longer reflected torchlight. They reflected Miss Marple. "You passed through," he said softly. "You always do." Her silence was sharper than any accusation. He lowered his head. "We thought it was containment, every time. But it isn't. It's release. The ritual isn't a seal. It's a hinge, and we swing it open, again and again." She stepped closer, watching him, not for lies, but for truths he feared she would uncover. "How long?" she asked. He swallowed hard. "The first record we have is from the plague years, but there are gaps wide enough to forget, until someone remembers. And me. You are the change, something introduced. You shouldn't be here. That's why the others loop, and you persist." He handed her a small object, cold and lighter than it should have been. It was a locket. Inside, a drawing. A girl. Marple recognized it instantly. Herself, age 7. The same drawing she had burned in her own fireplace at St. Mary Mead 30 years ago. She said nothing. "You're being watched," Gideon whispered. "Tested. I think you passed, and now it starts again, unless." He turned his head. Something in the trees responded. A voice not speaking words, but understanding. Miss Marple did not flinch. She looked down at the locket again. "And if I leave, you'll return," Gideon said. "Or someone else will. It resets. But this time we noticed. Then we break it," she said, calmly. He shook his head. "It doesn't break." She stepped past him, toward the far edge of the grove. He didn't follow, and she did not turn back. She walked, or thought she did, though every step took her deeper, not into forest, but into thought, memory, construction. The trees no longer followed natural order. They bent in deference to paths she had not intended to take, parting like silent crowds. With each step the ground cracked slightly, like old bones shifting beneath new skin. A structure emerged ahead. Not stone, not wood. A shape impossible to define. Part dwelling, part echo. Yet she recognized it. Her grandmother's parlor, the one that had burned down before she was born. It stood, fully formed, with the tea still warm and the lace still unsinged. No flame, no ruin, but memory made physical. Inside sat a man she had never seen, yet whose voice she knew. Gideon's, but older, far more exhausted, drained of all human tone. He did not greet her. He did not need to. "The lie must begin again," he said. Miss Marple stood at the threshold. "And if it doesn't," the man smiled, not warmly, but with understanding, "then you have changed the story, and they will write a new one. But not here, not this time." She stepped inside. The walls pulsed, not with sound, but with attention. The room acknowledged her, and something withdrew. She turned. A mirror on the mantelpiece showed a chapel. Rain falling, mourners in black, and a coffin bearing Reverend Talbot's name. Her hand reached forward on instinct, not intention. As it touched the glass, she stood once more at the edge of Black Hollow, the air still, the sky grey. A bell tolled. She turned slowly. Behind her, the village gathered, their eyes empty of memory, and Gideon stood beside her, no longer wounded, no longer mad. "The story begins again," he said, and in that moment, Miss Marple understood. The story had never been hers to tell. It had been told about her, and now it would be told again, with her as part of its memory, forever beginning, forever new. Chapter 10. The candle still burns. There is a sound that cannot be described, only remembered, the hush before a word is spoken that must not be repeated. And it was into that silence Miss Marple stepped, once more, as the door swung shut behind her, though she had not touched it. The parlour was exactly as it had been the day she arrived in Black Hollow. The books sat unread in the corner cabinet. The fire crackled in the grate, despite no wood having been placed since her return. And above the mantel, the photograph, Reverend Talbot's funeral hung crooked, though not in the same way. Her eyes narrowed. She crossed the room with deliberate slowness. Her footsteps left no mark on the rug. And when she reached the frame, she studied the faces, familiar, worn by time, shadowed by sorrow. The widow, the miller, the child with the drooping ribbon, and there, Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the group, one gloved hand resting upon the gate-post, a face frozen in quiet observation. The dress was hers, the brooch unmistakable. She had not been there, and yet there she was. She stepped back. Her chair, the same high-backed armchair in which she'd taken tea with Elsie's grandmother only days ago, now held a small child's doll, black thread for hair, buttons for eyes, its shoes mismatched. One of them was Elsie's. From somewhere, a corridor, a thought, a hallway that did not exist until now, came a child's voice, calm, measured, repeating a line from a rhyme that was never sung in any nursery. You are the candle now. No rush of emotion, no fear, just a recognition that her part had changed. She had been the witness, then the seeker, now the bearer. In the reflection of the brass kettle, she saw movement, not of her own, but another watching through her eyes. She turned. Nothing stood behind. And yet the air shifted, not in gusts, but like a curtain pulled taut by a hand one cannot see. She opened the drawer beneath the mantel clock, the same clock that had struck 13 when she first arrived. Inside, not cutlery, not keys, but ash, a pile of it, still warm. On top, a torn piece of newspaper, from a town that no longer had a press. It read, Inheritance delayed, heirloom missing from Vicar's estate. A red circle around the word heirloom, and below it, in faded ink, check the chapel, midnight, you are expected. From the forest beyond the village square, a shape moved, slowly, watching. It was Gideon. He did not approach. He merely waited, mouth moving in words too distant to hear, yet the shape of them unmistakable. One day you'll understand why it always has to be you. Miss Marple folded the paper, placed it in her pocket, and turned back to the photograph. This time, in the reflection of the glass, there were two of her. Midnight approached, not with the ticking of clocks, but with a slowing of time itself, as though the village around her bowed inward, preparing for a performance that had already been rehearsed countless times before. Miss Marple stepped outside with no coat, no lantern, only the weight of expectation clinging to her like a forgotten name. The chapel loomed, just as it had on her first day, stone dark with age, ivy clutching its bones, but now it hummed with memory, not sound. The bell tower was still, the sky starless. The door, once stuck from disuse, opened without resistance. Inside, no pews, no altar, only rows of mirrors, tall, narrow, flanking the aisle like mourners turned inward. Each one captured a different moment, her walking in, her pausing, her aged hands clasped behind her back, her eyes watching something unseen. No reflection matched the one she gave now. She walked past each without looking long, though one caught her breath. In it, she stood beside Gideon, and he was holding her hand. The centre of the chapel held a stone basin, dry, cracked. At its bottom, a child's ribbon, blue, curled as if twirled by habit. Elsie's. Next to it, the locket, closed now. She did not open it, not yet. A single candle burned beside the basin, black wax, steady flame. It cast no shadow, nor did she. You are the candle now, the voice said again, nearer now. A whisper carried without wind. She turned. No one. But on the far wall, the fresco, the same worn painting of saints and demons that had faded through centuries, now held something new. A woman in green, watching from a hillside, her eyes unmistakable. It was her. A figure stepped forward from between the mirrors, not reflected, real. Gideon. He looked tired, older than before, like a memory stretched too far across time. It's always you, he said. That's the design. Why? Her voice was low, not pleading, demanding. Because you remember, the rest forget. They must, otherwise it won't reset. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Reset into what? He stepped aside. Behind him, another mirror, larger than the rest, and within it, not her reflection, but a scene, the funeral. Reverend Talbot's, the first moment, Chapter 1. They watch us, he said, something other. We play it out. They study reaction. They change the variables, add grief, subtract innocence, recast the guilt. But you, Marple, you don't respond like the others. You disrupt. She approached the mirror. Her image did not appear. The candle flickered behind her but did not bend. And what happens if I refuse to continue? Gideon looked away. Then the village sleeps, until someone else answers the bell. She stared into the funeral scene. There by the gate, the woman in green stood again, watching. The candle, though untouched, began to melt faster, wax slipping in rivulets down its sides, hissing as it met the basin's cold stone. Marple's breath slowed. In the mirrors, she no longer moved. Only her reflection with Gideon did, and in that scene, he was smiling. From behind the mirrors, faint footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate, as though many were walking in time with one another, neither near nor far. She turned to the door, yet the chapel held no exit now, only the mirrors, the basin and the voice. Why, it always has to be you, it repeated again, this time not from Gideon, but from everywhere at once. Miss Marple touched the locket at last. It clicked open. Inside was no photograph, but a folded scrap of vellum, old, frayed. It read, in painstaking script, to the one who sees twice, you are not the candle, you are the match. Strike or be replaced. She looked up. The woman in green had vanished from the fresco. Now she stood beside the candle, and she wore Miss Marple's face. As the final wax fell, the chapel blinked, not faded, but ceased. She was in the parlour once more, the funeral photograph back on the wall, but now there were no other faces, only hers, and the candle, still burning. The story ends, or begins. Subscribe if you dare.